It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Matt Rutherford and welcome him to virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research. Dr. Rutherford is at the Oklahoma State University. He's the John D. Pope Chair in Entrepreneurship Research. He has a PhD from Auburn University. I know we have some PhD students from Auburn here with us today. That's where Dr. Rutherford got his PhD. He's been a special issue editor at Journal of Business Venturing and Journal of Small Business Management. He's also on the editorial board of several journals, too numerous to mention here. He's published in JBV, ET&P, JSBM, FBR, among others. With that, welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. And War Eagle to all you Auburn students out there.
Thank you, Matt, for being willing to talk to us today. And my first question to you is, how did you get interested in entrepreneurship research?
Probably like a lot of people, I grew up in it. You know, my dad was a small business owner, kind of reluctantly. My brother is and was an entrepreneur, sort of a portfolio entrepreneur. So just being around it all the time is how I decided to sort of go into entrepreneurship in general. And then, you know, I did my undergraduate degree at a school that probably no one has heard of, called Ball State University, and that's in Indiana. And my professor and my undergraduate there was a guy named Don Karatko, who has now sort of become super famous. He's in the stratosphere, but he got me excited about research, specifically research in entrepreneurship. And after I went to work after college, I decided I didn't like work that much, and school sounded like a better idea. So I went back to school and never left.
So Matt, you've done a lot of work in bootstrapping, and people have read your work today for today's session on bootstrapping. What do you think are some problems and opportunities in the extant bootstrapping literature? In other words, how do you see the future of bootstrapping research?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you read my article and didn't fall asleep, which is incredible because almost no one can read my articles without falling asleep. But if you did and got all the way through them, first, congratulations. But second, you'll see that I do feel sort of strongly about the lack of theory in bootstrapping, and it's a great way to ask that question, Dr. Gupta, because a lot of the things that are these big problems have opportunities. And as someone entering the field, you should know that it is challenging to publish bootstrapping research. I don't know why I keep doing it, actually, but I do, specifically because it is, and some people will get mad at me for saying this, but it is sort of atheoretical at this point. And in that GOM article, I tried to say really strongly that I feel that it's a construct. It's a thing, and it's a thing that we can measure. So it can also be a variable, but I don't know that it's a theory. I just don't know that we have enough understanding around what it is and a logic base around it to call it a theory. Again, which is okay. We have lots of really good theories that can complement the construct of bootstrapping that I think is the best way forward. And in that GOM article, I sort of suggested signaling, and I think in the other one, I think that was the one where we talked about some other, bricolage. I think bricolage is pretty exciting as a complementary base, and effectuation and some other things that I think really could pair up nicely with the construct of bootstrapping. Now, I will also say though, if the sort of watershed piece by Winborg and Landstrom, I think is the watershed piece in the literature in 2001, that really strongly argues for a theory of bootstrapping. So it is not a decided issue that there is no theoretical framework or paradigm of bootstrapping. That's my strong opinion. Others will differ. So you can decide how you feel about that. I will tell you, I think without a complementary theory base, you will struggle to publish bootstrapping research. So if your goal is to enter a PhD program and be successful, that's something you should probably think about. So again, the opportunity there I think is really exciting because there are probably other logics and theories that we could even think of to match up with bootstrapping, but no one has really started investigating, or no one has really started meshing this construct with these other theories. So yeah, that's wide open. And to me, that's exciting. I hope it's exciting to you. So I would say, if you do like bootstrapping, please do it. We need so much more of it, and we need good work in it. But be careful with it. It can be challenging.
So Matt, you mentioned Winberg and Landstrom as the I think you said seminal work in
it's a watershed piece.
It's a watershed piece, a milestone.
Yeah.
And yet in your 2017 review, you disagreed with them. And for the benefit of our audience here who are junior scholars, just starting out their careers, could you help them understand how, as a researcher, we can think of something as a watershed or seminal contribution and yet respectfully disagree with it? Could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Again, a great question, Dr. Gupta, and thank you. Absolutely, I can. But if that article hadn't been written, I would have never thought about the things that I was thinking about to publish that 17 piece. So that, and you'll see, if you sort of look back at the literature, that article really sort of reinvigorated. At that point, the literature is sort of plateaued. We didn't know where to go with it. It wasn't all that exciting. And when they published that piece, that generated a lot more excitement around the construct. So yeah, I respect that article a ton, and it did get me thinking about that 17 piece, but it got me thinking about, can we do this maybe a little bit better? Is there certainly not that they were wrong in any way, but is there a revision or an expansion of their logic that can maybe help us understand this a little better? And that's what we do, right? That's what academics do. Which is
wonderful. I love how you explained that, and I think for our participants that's very useful. Now, as a reviewer and editor, so sort of switching hats here a little bit, what do you look for in a paper? How do you decide if a paper has potential to be published or not?
Yeah, I would love to hear what your other speakers say about this, because when you as an author, when you get reviews, you often wonder, what in the world are they looking at? But I'll tell you what I look at, and it's subjective. Is it interesting? I mean, everyone loves a good story. I don't care at what level or what level of sufficiency or technical understanding that you are. Everyone loves a good story. Everyone loves a good hook. And does it do something for the field? Is there something here that's going to move theory and practice forward? And that's really the first thing. But now I do that before I move on to looking at the technical aspects of the paper. So I will say, is this good? Is this interesting? Who cares? And that's honestly, I say those words to myself, who cares? And if there's a good answer to that question, then honestly, I'll go right to the method section at that point and say, all right, well, if there is a method section, if it's an empirical piece, and say, is the research design appropriate? Is their sample appropriate? Was their analysis tool appropriate? And sort of run through those things.
Wonderful. And before I turn it over to the audience for questions, one last question from me, which is, can you tell us about one bootstrapping paper you're working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the research team? Where are you in the process?
So this is a good example of why it's hard to publish bootstrapping research. But I do have a paper right now that is looking at the way bankers eventually decide to fund a bootstrapper. So at some point, most bootstrappers, most firms, if they survive and grow at all, will eventually go seek some external funding. So this paper is looking at, all right, how do bankers, specifically bankers, which if you look at the literature, well, there's not a lot of literature in new venture finance. So if you're interested in finance and entrepreneurship at all, that's an exciting area. You don't have to do bootstrapping. You can do something else, but that's an area where we need good work. And I think it's wide open. If you look at the works of a Mike Wright, for example, a fantastic scholar, and that unfortunately he's no longer with us, but a fantastic scholar in new venture finance. And that's just a ton of work to be done there. But anyway, we look at bankers and how bankers view bootstrappers, which there's just not a lot of work on that. And we look at venture capitalists all the time, but no businesses get funded by venture capitalists. It's far less than 1% of startups that get funded by any equity at all. That's not inside equity. That's not owner's equity. So we look at this at bankers and sort of how they judge and how they perceive these firms, and they do fund them. We know that. We don't really understand why or how bankers fund them. So that's what this paper is. There's a complementary theory base in here, obviously, and we use signaling for this, which has its own challenges, by the way. You'll probably hear other people talk about signaling and fun trying to publish signaling stuff, but that's what we did on that paper. So I'll present it at the Babson Entrepreneurship Research Conference in, well, my God, less than a month. I better get that presentation together. So I'll do that. That's where it is at this point. Hopefully I'll get some excellent feedback there. I'm actually really looking forward to the feedback presenting that paper because we need it. So that team, doctoral students, I mean, at this stage in my career, that's how I put together almost all of my research is from ideas that my doctoral students either have or that we came up with together. And then I'll have a senior doctoral student and then a junior doctoral student. And if we need some heft, then I might go ask one of my colleagues that's either a method expert or an expert in that theory. But for this team, it's just it's myself, 2 doctoral students, and we do have a methods expert on this.
Perfect. Now I'll turn it over to the students for to the participants for questions, but we have a question from Kenya that was being asked just before we welcomed you. And I want to paraphrase that question just to get us started, and then Lucy can sort of, ask a more detailed question. The question was, bootstrapping also seems to exist in other cultures outside the US. And one of the cultures we talked about was Kenya, but it seems to be more in the informal economy in Kenya. Do you see this difference between formal and informal economy in terms of bootstrapping?
Man, what another great, you could research that forever. That's fascinating. So yes, bootstrapping is more common outside of the US or really any developed economies. And in most developing economies, that's all there is, right? If we define bootstrapping as the decision to start a business without taking external funding, that's virtually every business that's not in a developed economy. And even within the US and Western Europe, that's a small number. I mean, it's less than 20% that actually take any external finance. So yeah, absolutely, that's the case. And in the informal economy, yeah, I mean, who's going to fund you? If you're in any economy, if you're in or any country or any cultural context, if you're in an informal economy, the investors don't get too excited about that because we have this thing that we call transparency, right? And investors like to invest in transparent organizations. That is, I can see what you're doing. I know what you're up to. If you're lying to me, I'm going to figure it out. And I know what your organization is. When there's a lack of transparency, I don't want to invest in that. And if I do invest in it, I'm going to charge you a really big interest rate. So in the informal economy, what you'll find are loan sharks. That's sort of those are the people that will invest. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. By the way, another great thing to research, loan sharks and their role in funding any entrepreneurial enterprise and sort of the gray economy, the gray market, if you will, is fascinating. So, but yeah, that was a long answer, I know. But yeah, these bootstrapping, the more we learn about bootstrapping, the more we can help all entrepreneurs, but especially in developing economies, because that's what's going to happen. You are going to bootstrap. Now, you're not going to take any external funding. So that means you've got issues, right? You have resource issues. Now what? Now what? And that's where that really exciting work from effectuation and bricolage and signaling and all these other things can really inform us into really entrepreneurial activities that need to be taken because of the decision not to take any external finance. So yeah, yes, I think it's more applicable there than in a U.S. context.
Wonderful. Now I'll invite Oscar to ask his question.
Hi, Professor. First, I want to say that I don't agree with you about your paper because I enjoyed reading. Was not boring at all. In fact, I enjoy so much reading your article that I have so many questions that unfortunately I only can ask one. But my question is more in terms of bootstrapping. Can you consider that it's only something that is related with financial capital acquisition? It means cannot be extended to other areas like corporate entrepreneurship, for example, or in where the divisions are fighting for legitimacy internally to obtain capital from the CEO or funding resources so they are forced to do bootstrapping, looking for that legitimacy inside competition internally in the firms.
So yeah, again, great question, and yes, then that's an area that can definitely be explored. I guess my argument would be just so we can organize the literature better. And again, if you read that paper, you'll see my main gripe about bootstrapping research is we're just disorganized. And until we get the literature somehow, there's a ton of library books and they're all interesting, but they're all on the floor. So until we can get those onto the shelves and catalog, we're not going to be able to grow the area. So for your phenomenon of sort of operating in a bootstrapped fashion in a larger firm, I would argue for a new construct. Let's call that something else, because if you're already in an organization, you have resources, right? You have a lot more resources than a startup entrepreneur, for example, who didn't take any funding. So there's an enormous difference between an individual in an organization that's is using some of Winborg and Landstrom's bootstrapping mechanisms. There's an enormous difference between that person and the entrepreneur who's just starting up. So, but there's certainly similarities. So yeah, let's call that something else, and then let's research that. And that would be, you could do that. You could research that for the rest of your life.
Perfect. Anja, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. And I agree with Oscar. I really enjoyed reading your articles. I'm kind of a fan of signaling theory, use it a lot. And I was kind of, looking at, wow, he's looking at point signals. Is he looking at a signal set? And what can offset the reaction, from bootstrapping to the investor as being negative? So are you planning articles in the future where you look at a signal set and how those signals interact with each other in the impact?
That's exactly the paper that I'm presenting in 3 weeks. Yeah.
And I'm going to miss it.
Well, yeah, if you want to email me, I'll send you what we have. It's yeah, it just got rejected at a really good journal. So there you go. I've been rejected at the finest journals in the world. So yeah, so no, I'll send you that. We got some great feedback on it. It almost got in, but didn't quite make it. So yeah, send me an email and I'll send you the draft.
Thank you so much.
You got it.
So Matt, just as an aside, I think sometimes new entrants to the field think that once you're a senior scholar, you don't get rejected. Do you want to take a minute to sort of talk about that, maybe?
This is a great time in my career to ask me that, because it goes like that, and I am definitely in a slump right now. So no, the most common result of a submitted article is a rejection. And even, I guess I can think of a few people where that might not be true. Dr. Gupta probably knows them. But for 99% of us, no, it's far less than 10% and probably less than 5% that actually get in.
Great, thank you. Rodrigo, you want to go next?
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Rutherford, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. One thing that caught my attention in the papers that you were reading is that most of the entrepreneurs prefer to bootstrap. By your experience, do you think this preference may change by the amount of means this entrepreneur has? For example, Maybe if the entrepreneur has more capabilities and more means, he will prefer to bootstrap, but necessity entrepreneurs that maybe are choosing a more informal way, they would choose to receive funds if they have these opportunities. That's very difficult.
And that's interesting. And I actually think it's interesting because it's the opposite of what you're suggesting. I don't know, but it would be neat to set up a study and say, so yeah, my argument would be, before you ask that question, I've always sort of said, yeah, Warren Buffett can bootstrap all he wants. You know, he's loaded. He doesn't need it. But the more I think about that, I don't think Warren Buffett ever bootstraps. I think he always goes and reduces his risk by taking it. And we think about Elon Musk right now, right? He could have funded Twitter by himself. He could have done that. He looked at it and said, that's not smart. I'm going to use some of my funds and I'm going to leverage those funds, you know, into getting other investors. And I'm sure he has some leverage. I'm sure he has some debt in there as well. So, well, really interesting. But if you set it up and said, no, these guys should bootstrap more, but I bet you they don't. I bet you they actually are more likely to organize whatever, a syndicate or a group of investors to do whatever they're going to do. But that's an empirical question that needs an answer.
And the way you answered it got me thinking that maybe there's a way to set up an experiment to even look at whether the tendency to bootstrapping is higher or lower in resource-constrained individuals or resource-rich individuals. I know Oscar's been thinking about experiments, so maybe there's something to study there.
Yep, you could do that next week. Yeah, that'd be great.
Lucy, you want to go next?
Yes, Prof, I'd like to go next, but I just want to still ask the question that earlier on asked about bootstrapping. And the question was, with currently what is happening is entrepreneurs are having access to small loans as small as $10. And this loan can easily be gotten from your mobile phone. So if you're carrying out a transaction and you're not able to complete it, then you can get it directly using your mobile application. So that is coming in as another area. So instead of mobilizing from friends, you can use that option. Then there is the option of table banking, where a group of people come together, put together funds, and then these funds are shared. The other one that is very popular is coming in form of circles or cooperative societies, where these groups sit together and then they share funds. And from what I'm realizing in my country is this is growing, and it is actually overtaking the banking industry in Kenya generally. So if you look at it, everyone is dependent on this. So the idea of bootstrapping, could it be affected by these other alternatives, measures of accessing finance? So I don't know if that can have some impact on the area or not, if someone can look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, so great question. And if you ask Winborg and Landstrom, they will tell you that's bootstrapping, especially the sharing of resources first. And that's bootstrapping, and it's a special kind of bootstrapping called joint utilization. So that's what they would tell you. And they would also tell you that's a very good way to bootstrap. On theoretically, that should result in survival and growth. Anytime you're sharing resources with other entrepreneurs, that's joint utilization. Now, I would say it's not bootstrapping because they have elected to take external funds, and they moved on to another really exciting theory. So again, I think Ted Baker and his bricolage work can really inform that discussion, that creative activity of sharing, and the way that you do it. And then how do you choose your network to share with? That's absolutely critical, that you choose a network in an ideal way, that everyone is leveraging strengths and covering up weaknesses, and you're building your social capital and all those things. And that's what bricolage is, and that's what effectuation is. So to me, I would say let's okay, you've chosen to finance in a very interesting way. You're no longer bootstrapping. And now let's move on to some of these other really rich logic bases to try to explore that behavior, which is absolutely just fascinating stuff. And I think especially the sharing of resources, I mean, I think at least anecdotally, the evidence shows that works. And it has unbelievably powerful upside.
And your response to Lucy's question gets me to think that sometimes when we explain to junior researchers how the framing of the paper matters and how it needs to change based on the response we are getting from editors and reviewers, that's sort of what you're getting at, right? Somebody could frame it as bootstrapping, and depending on what the feedback it got from reviewers and editors, they might need to change the framing to bricolage or anything else, and also would influence like what papers they are citing, right? Winsberg and Landstrom or Rutherford, right? I mean, is that sort of what you're getting at?
You've nailed it. Yeah, you've nailed it. So yeah, and in that paper, I talk about financial bootstrapping versus strategic bootstrapping. And so Winsberg and Landstrom, and they didn't call it this, I did. So I'm not putting words in their mouths. They might disagree with me. They like a more strategic form of bootstrapping. In that case, that would definitely fit your example. And those entrepreneurs who are sharing financing are bootstrapping. They're joint utilization bootstrappers. But by definition, they're not. I would say there's something closer to, and I don't think they're necessarily, they probably are effectuating. There's some blend there of effectuation and bricolage that they're involved in.
Perfect.
And it's a networking paper too. If you like networking or social networks, my goodness, that's really, really good.
Yeah, I think Lucy is on to something with that.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I hope she pursues it further. Navneet, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Professor Vishal, and my compliments to Professor Matt. It was very lucid way in which you had explained to us about bootstrapping. I was going through your paper and your talk now. A couple of data or figures that you mentioned is one, you said that only 1% of startups are funded by venture capital. You also told us that 20% of startups sort of take external funds. So my question is there some structured data this way which says that what is the type of external funding a startup goes, something like this, so that when we take a class on entrepreneurial finance for the students, such type of data will be helpful to know that which is the most popular way of a startup getting funded and then how to take that forward. So I just wanted to know your views on whether such type of data is consolidated, available for any ecosystem, because it could be different for different countries. But if you're aware of such data for any ecosystem, any country, I thought if you can share your views on that, it will be great. Thank you.
Yeah, nice question. Yeah, and then my data is from the US. So if you're US based, go to the Kauffman Foundation. That would be the first place I start for this type. Obviously, the census, the US Census is good, better than you think, actually, at recording some of these things. So if you're in a US context, you're in pretty good shape. But I would honestly start with Kauffman. They do a better job than anyone. And then obviously I don't know about everyone's specific context, but the GEM data that's collected by a consortium of universities, Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, does have some of this data as well. The World Bank has a lot of this data. So I guess I'd probably start at the World Bank and then go to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor and see if there's good stuff there. But Kauffman has some stuff on international rates as well.
Perfect. Manash, you want to go next?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Professor Vishal and Professor Matt, for such a wonderful session. My question is towards understanding from what Professor Vishal has also mentioned about those companies such as people like Tesla, organizations like Tesla and all, are they kind of done from a bootstrapping point of view or not? But my question is towards more about motivation. So like when we talked about, when your paper also said that 1% only is funded by venture capitalists and rest are all kind of bootstrapped. So in that sense, can we reimagine about bootstrapping as a necessity or an opportunity-driven entrepreneurs? And can we think from that direction that how does entrepreneurial motivation is connected to bootstrapping? Like we know most organizations are, or most ventures are generally necessity driven, and are in that sense are not very successful in terms of growth and creating jobs and everything, and the rest which are very successful or are trying to uncover opportunities are mostly opportunity driven. So can we think in that sense also that entrepreneurial motivation also is kind of connected strongly with bootstrapping?
Yeah, great question. So it's the finance people sort of call that supply side or demand side, right? Are they bootstrapping because they have to or because they want to? And the motivation, yeah, I mean, why are you doing it? And I would go, and this is a personal preference that I'm really interested in actually, is to check their assessments of risk. And if you look at the literature on risk and entrepreneurship, and I've just done this recently, this blew my mind actually. We have a very narrow conceptualization of how we measure risk. If you go to the finance literature or the economics literature, there are a zillion different types of risk that are honestly probably more important than the way that we measure, probably more applicable to our setting than the way that we measure it. But the way that entrepreneurs feel about risk will drive that decision to bootstrap or not. I mean, that's it. To me, that's why we have most of the bootstrappers that we have, at least in the developed world. We have most of the bootstrappers we have because they choose not to, and they choose not to because they perceive that taking any external funding would be risky, either to their personal finance, but probably more likely to their autonomy. I think that's it. Is that the one thing we really know about people that start businesses are they do it because they crave autonomy, and so because I crave autonomy, I don't want to be involved with anyone else. And that's interesting because entrepreneurship is a collective activity. I mean, you're going to have to be involved with people, whether it's your customers or your financiers or employees or whatever. So yeah, really digging into that and trying to understand what is that conceptualization of risk. As I just said, I mean, Elon Musk isn't going to bootstrap because it's too risky, right? So he's probably not an idiot. I mean, you could disagree, but probably not. He's probably not an idiot. So why then would an entrepreneur say, I'm going to do the opposite? And they do. That's the behavior. That's what they do. So let's understand that. And I'm sure there are very good reasons for it. Let's really dig into that and understand what that motivation is. And okay, it's autonomy. That's great, but you don't want to fail either. So yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, because my prior to joining my PhD program, I was also in some sort of entrepreneurial venture, and that was also driven by bootstrapping. And the more the greater reason for bootstrapping was related to risk that you have mentioned. So yeah, it will be very interesting to study.
Yeah, and look at different types of risks. Just go take you could probably look on Wikipedia. I didn't say that, but you could probably just get a listing of risks, right? I think there's a ton of them that we've never even thought about of types of risk.
And that also gets to how one thinks of research ideas, right? I mean, the contribution one could make by saying, here's how risk has been looked at the finance and economics literature. We can bring it to entrepreneurship and management. Here's how we would use it, right? So
that's a game changer to me. That's a game changer.
What Dr. Rutherford just did is give you a phenomenal research idea that I would think has potential to get published in any of the good journals if done well. Yeah, good. So Junho, you want to go next?
Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. Oh yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. So I have a quick question about the performance of bootstrapping firms. So are bootstrapping firms still promising and scale up well and quickly like the startups that gather huge external fundings from accelerators or venture capitalists? So my concern or predisposition in here is bootstrappers might not be those who aim rapid growth or something like that. Or it will be also great to know some examples of strategic bootstrappers, like who intentionally choose not to raise funds, but having a rapid growth or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any examples off the tip of my tongue, but I can tell you could, if you Googled successful bootstrappers, you'd see a ton of them because we celebrate. This is popular press, just stars. The popular press, at least in the US, absolutely loves bootstrappers that are successful. And then so that we write articles about them. But I'll probably think of some when I'm talking here. You're probably thinking of some right now. but they started from nothing and they somehow scratched their way to the top. But as you probably realize, right, we celebrate them because they are outliers, and there aren't many of them. And because they're outliers, you know, what does that mean? Well, they're not the average. Well, then what is the average? Well, the average is the bootstrapper fails. And so that is an interesting case to me. And so we've got to be very careful with that. And this might go to your teaching a little more than your research. But when we talk to our students about some of these things, and we can celebrate people that bootstrap, certainly we should, but also be real with them and say, you know, most of them don't. Most of them, in fact, don't make it. So I can't think of examples of that right now. And I'm sorry, I think you had another question in there that I couldn't quite hear. So there, just Google it. You'll find a ton of them.
Appreciate it.
Oscar, you get the last audience question.
Again, Professor. Once again, very rich, all your commentaries. I have the impression that in sometimes bootstrapping might be a consequence of bad pitching when you are not able to well pitch your idea to bankers or financiers, and where you are not able to transmit probably the skills, the experience that your organization and the network that you have correctly to the other part. But my question is, in that sense, when you mention the activities that the entrepreneurs should engage, one of them mentions to the business plan. And for me, probably, I think, I don't know if you agree with me, that effectuation cannot just be a consequence of bootstrapping, but also an antecedent to bootstrapping. Because if the entrepreneur is effectual, he's not going to try to prepare a business plan because he's not looking to predict anything. So normally they avoid to predict. So by consequence, they are not going to be able to prove to anyone that their venture is feasible. So they need to bootstrap. I don't know if you agree with me in my.
I definitely don't disagree. You know, the question would be, it becomes a cognitive argument. Do I decide to effectuate first, or do I decide to not take external funding first, or do I do them both at the same time? It's probably parallel, right? As soon as I decide, and effectuation is the bigger construct. So as soon as I decide to effectuate, you're right, that's done. That decision has been made. So yeah, it probably happens first. The effectuation decision probably happens first.
In parallel, that can happen at the same time. So
right. I mean, it's like that. So it happens bang, bang in your brain. But it's if I had to say right now, if you're an effectuator, you probably decided that first. Probably.
Thank you, Professor.
Wonderful. So now it's time for us to transition to sort of the last phase of this session, which is, what is one advice you would offer to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Well, like I said, it always depends on when you ask me. If everything's going great research-wise, I'm going. So since it's going here right now, I'll be a little glum. No, I really won't. What I'll say is, yeah, try to just stay positive. There's way more negative feedback than you think there is in this profession, especially if you want to be successful in publishing. You are going to get a lot of negative feedback. You just are. It's okay. It feels personal. It's not. But also know it doesn't go away. So even though you're going to be just starting out, even as a full professor, it still hurts my feelings when the reviewers say mean things to me. But it's something that you're just going to have to be ready for. Have a plan to be resilient. Have a plan to deal with the negative feedback when it comes. But there's so many fun things to look at. There's so many fun things about this job, and there's just a great way to spend your career is exploring your curiosities. I honestly can't think, it's not even close. I don't know what the second best job to be a professor is, but it's not even close to me. So try to focus on the positive when there's negative feedback happening. And when you get positive feedback, celebrate. Because it doesn't happen very often. So, and you do it when you get a revise and resubmit. And so essentially what that means is when you submit an article out, if you're not familiar, there's really only two things that can happen. It can be rejected or they can say, yeah, we don't hate it, revise it and send it back, and then we'll decide if we hate it then. So when you get that revise, celebrate. Go out to dinner, go do whatever you do, but celebrate right then, because it's it'll sort of be downhill from there. But that's what you should do. So that's my advice. So stay positive. It's great. Don't get too down, and understand that everyone's in the same boat. It always, whenever you get a rejection, it seems like everyone around you is getting acceptances. They're not. It just seems that way.
Great advice. And if someone wants to ask you follow-up questions or reach out to you, would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So perfect. Thank you, Matt, for your time. Thank you for generously sharing your advice with our audience, and I look forward to seeing you sometime.
Hey, you too. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. You guys let me know if you need anything. You know how to get in touch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.